I see. Thank you. I see people are still joining, so we're gonna give it another couple of minutes, then we'll start. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining again, and good afternoon. A few more people in the waiting room. Okay, I think we can start. Thank you so much for joining this webinar organized by the GBV Community of Practice on addressing the backlash against gender and GBV and its implications for humanitarian settings. My name is Shiva Sharifzad. I'm the co-moderator of GBV Community of Practice with my colleague here, Sarah Martin. I will be moderating the session today, and I really look forward to hear from our presenters and panelists and also from you. And Sarah, over to you in case you want to introduce yourself.
Hi, everyone. My name is Sarah Martin. I'm one of the community practice moderators, and I'd like to thank Shiva for organizing this webinar and our speakers today. And I look forward to hearing everything. I'll be managing the chat, so if you have any questions, you can put them in there, and I'll keep an eye on them. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. I'm gonna give a brief introduction, if I can move my slides, on GBV Community of Practice. And in case you are not familiar with it or if you're not a member, and then I will introduce our presenters today and also a brief introduction on what we mean by backlash and why we organize this webinar. So GBV Community of Practice, it's a community of over 1,000 GBV and emergency specialists around the world. We offer a virtual platform with webinars like the one you're attending now, capacity building events, peer-to-peer support, and it's also a place for you to connect with other GBV specialists, to ask questions, provide support, or share resources. Membership in this community of practice is free and it's for any individual working in GBV in emergencies. So you are a member of community practice as yourself, not as your organization. If you want any information about joining or about community of practice, you can send us a message to gbvcop@gmail.com. We're going to also put it in the chat and we would be very happy to see you there. The webinar will be recorded and we will share it with everyone who has registered. Please feel free also to share any material that you have developed on this topic. You can put them in the chat and then we will also collect them and we will send the resource list along with other materials from this webinar. We're gonna have a Q&A after the presentations. So you can add your questions to the Q&A button at the bottom, or you can also put it in the chat. We will monitor the chat. And we would like to ask you to stay until the end of the webinar to give us some feedback. There will be a short poll. And if not, you can always share any comments or thoughts with us directly at gbvcop@gmail.com. Now, going back to the topic of today and this webinar on navigating backlash against gender and GBV programming in humanitarian settings. We understand that this might be a bit heavy for some people in this space, as we all have been personally impacted. We've been backlashed in the past few years at least. So please let us know if you have any difficulty or challenges that you would like to share. And we will have a brief introduction on the backlash, as I mentioned, about what it means, how it is being manifested across different contexts. And then we will hear first from Jeannette Franguier from the Association of Himaya Daim Ata in Lebanon. Thank you for joining, Jan. Then we have Kaniz Gofrani Qureshi from Population Services and Training Center, who will talk about how this backlash is impacting their work in Bangladesh. And after that, Sherry Kraham Talabani from Seed Kurdistan, who will also tell us about the dynamics in Iraq and Kurdistan region and how it is impacting their work. So a huge thank you to presenters for putting their time to talk us through this topic. And to kick off the discussion, I think it's important to give some background so that we are all on the same page to know what we mean by backlash and why is it becoming an important topic and what is the urgency now at the moment to talk about it. The urgency of this topic has been growing for some time. In 2024, the Community of Practice hosted a webinar on the increasing backlash against gender equality. And since then, there have been some global events, especially within humanitarian context, that have made this issue even more pressing. So now, today, we're not just observing backlash, but we are also operating within it. And what do we mean by this backlash and how can we navigate it? We have to respond to this question first as people working in this sector. Well, we have to survive, but also to make sure that the life-saving services for women and girls are not lost and the decades of progress made by feminist and women rights movements are safeguarded. About this backlash, so over the past few years, we've seen global developments that show we cannot take the progress toward gender equality granted. It can stall and it can even reverse. Some argue that this is cyclical. There are periods of progress that are followed by regression, that are linked to economic instability or broader societal threats, which might be true, but something that is for sure is like we are currently in one of those periods of regression. There are rights that are being challenged, protection is being weakened, and conservative ideologies are increasingly shaping public discourse, which are creating an environment of resistance toward individual rights, specifically women and LGBTQI rights, and also migrants, refugees, and other minorities. It's important to know that this backlash is not random or isolated, it is structural. It is not simply about disagreement over gender issues, but it is organized, strategic, and often policy driven. It can show itself as restriction on rights, shrinking civic space, attacks on feminist actors, and rollback on institutional commitments to gender equality. It's like a Handmaid's Tale scenario, if you might, if you're not already tired with this example. And across many countries that we are seeing this shift toward more conservative and far-right policies that they are not only affecting their own national context, but they're also shaping international agendas and humanitarian priorities. And how do we see this backlash manifested? So it can have several forms. The first one is political backlash. We see this in public discourse, in elections, in legislation, where protection is weakened or overturned. For example, in United States, we are seeing the rollback on reproductive rights. Or in Afghanistan, that we are seeing, I mean, also recent news, more and more state-sponsored gender exclusion. In Hungary, it's anti-gender legal framework that they have. In Poland, they also have restrictions on reproductive and civic rights. In Brazil, mainly during Bolsonaro, there were efforts to dismantle gender-focused policies. In Russia and Georgia, there is shrinking space for GBV advocacy. Or, for example, in Turkey, the government left the Istanbul Convention, which is formally known as the Council of Europe Convention on Preventing and Combating Violence Against Women. And they're banning, for example, pride marches, introducing new legal restrictions on LGBTQI rights. And just to note that these figures that you see on these slides, it's not about just the political figure, but it's also about what they represent. The other type of backlash that we are seeing is cultural and religious backlash that sometimes it's very difficult to distinguish it from political one. That's why I've put, for example, for Afghanistan and Iran, like a bit in the middle. Here, conservative beliefs reinforce traditional gender roles and stereotypes. They limit the space for change, which can also turn into political backlash, or they reinforce each other. And in here, the enforcement of strict gender norms is justified through religious legitimacy or culture. For example, Iran, as you know, like with the strict law that they have on women and their participation or their clothing, or for Pakistan, there is also increasing backlash against women rights movements, accusing them of promoting Western or immoral values, and religious and cultural arguments are used to discredit activists there. The other sort of manifestation of this backlash is anti-right movements. This includes groups, incel communities, other movements that they feel threatened by gender equality gains. There is a whole online anti-feminist ecosystem, including incels, red pill influencers, men's rights activists that they frame narrative as feminist and women that they've gone too far. Or there are also anti-feminist or men rights activist demonstrations, for example, in countries like South Korea or United States. As you can see, some figures of these movements can be quite influential also in political sphere and in the policies related to social media or public discourse on these kind of platforms about gender. The last one is institutional and international policy shifts. I wish, as the picture showing here on this slide, we could say that this category was not found, but it was just difficult to represent it in any sort of image. But I think all of us here that we are here today, we have seen it unfolding around us, at least in the last couple of years. There are decisions that are made by government and international organizations that they shape funding, priorities, and what is considered acceptable programming. There are some coordinated anti-gender movements within these international spaces, and in some cases, institutions are shifting their policy based on the above mentioned, as I mentioned, the backlash that political, religious, or cultural level. And these ones are quite interconnected. So what we see now unfolding around us is not just one of them. For example, a government adopts anti-gender policies, reduces funding for international aid, then organizations, either out of necessity to maintain their funding or resume their funding, or sometimes because of their own alignment with these policies, they begin to scale back also or to depoliticize their gender and GBV work. And any parallel or resemblance to real life events here are very much intentional. And putting it on the humanitarian context as what we are seeing is backlash is adding another layer to what we know already exists in humanitarian settings. For example, about protection systems that are weakened, patriarchal norms that are intensified, civic space that is shrinked. And when you put backlash layered onto this, these effects are also amplified. And in GBV and gender programming, this translates into several key challenges. For example, we have constraints on access that organizations operating in a context that is also facing the backlash, they have increasing restrictions from control or limited access to communities, from resistance from conservative actors, and they're also forced to make some programmatic adaptations. For example, to continue operating, many are forced to reframe their language, as we are seeing Yemen. They are forced to avoid explicit feminist terminology, or they do self-censorship, or they have to reduce visibility of their gender-focused work. And these adaptations may allow access for organizations, but they also risk diluting the core objectives of GBV programming. The other one is the impact on staff and the humanitarian space, meaning the people who are doing the work. We are seeing online and offline harassment, increased fear, especially for national staff. As we saw yesterday in the news, a national staff of UNFPA in Afghanistan was killed because of her work in the UN. And we might need to look into the responsibility of international organizations in protecting their staff, but probably we need another webinar for that. And they're also facing, for example, reduced willingness to engage in advocacy, or they have internal tensions within organizations or emotional burnout. And the impact, and just to add that women-led organizations, they have another layer of this too. For example, the security risks are also much more for them, or they face administrative and funding challenges, and they also face tokenistic inclusion in humanitarian responses. And finally, as many of us are already experiencing this, is the issue of funding. And reductions in funding for gender and GBV programming have been severe in the past couple of years. Organizations are making difficult choices, either to put the limited resource to less sensitive areas, or to adjust their language to align with donor expectations, or to avoid politically sensitive issues to maintain their funding. And this becomes a cycle where the areas that they need attention and they need the more resources are becoming the most underfunded. And so this is the landscape that we are operating in. Now, to put them more into context, I would invite our panelists. We are going to hear from our colleagues in Lebanon, Bangladesh, and Iraq about how they are experiencing this backlash in these specific contexts and what have been the implications for their work and how they are maintaining their programming despite these challenges. First, I would like to invite Jean from Association Himaya Daim Ataya. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. To
Perfect.
to speak about Lebanon with the current war and the impacts of defunding and the humanitarian situation that was present even before all of this. Jean, thank you for joining, and over to you. I'm going to put your presentation up.
Yeah, thank you so much, Shiva. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. I know how much everyone is really overwhelmed. So thank you so much for being here with us. And thank you for Sarah and Shiva for taking the lead on preparing this webinar. So as Shiva was saying, I will be talking about the context of Lebanon and what's happening for the moment. As you may know that when we speak about war in Lebanon today, we are not speaking only about bombs or displacement. We are speaking about a crisis layered on top of years of economic collapse, institutional fragility, and social exhaustion. Really, in Lebanon, we feel this fatigue. And for women and girls, especially, this was created a crisis within a crisis, where protection risks and gender-based violence intensively are higher, and while access to service becomes more limited. Saying that, the GBV risks increase during conflict. We all know that when there is any conflict, GBV risks increase. So how this conflict increases GBV risks? Conflicts does not create gender inequality. It amplifies existing inequalities. Already we have this inequality, and conflict, it will create a higher pressure and it will amplify it. So we know that during periods of insecurity and displacement, women and girls often become trapped in unsafe environments and with fewer coping mechanisms and fewer protection systems, and especially during now, because we have this cut of funds as well. So in Lebanon, we have seen increased stress inside households due to poverty, unemployment, trauma, and now displacement all over. So these pressures directly contribute to higher levels of intimate partner violence and harmful coping strategies. So why we're talking about a crisis within crisis? Why Lebanon is a unique GBV emergency? The challenge in Lebanon is that GBV programming is operating inside multiple simultaneous emergencies, as I said. We have one emergency coming after the other. And even when services exist, survivors may not be able to physically reach them because we have a lot of hard to reach areas. And here is the problem. And sometimes they cannot afford even transportation with this economic crisis, access to communication tools as well, and safely disclose violence, because they are living now, displaced people, in informal settlements, in very crowded shelters, so they cannot have easy access to do any disclosure about violence. So humanitarian needs are increasing while resources are shrinking. So if you want to talk about challenges facing GBV programming, first of all, we have operational challenges for GBV actors. We know that local organizations are expected to respond immediately during emergencies. However, they are often underfunded and overstretched. And this is the case now in Lebanon, and I think in different contexts as well. But the difference is that in Lebanon, not only we have the problem of underfunded organization, but we do have this emergency and this overwhelmed work for social workers and for organizations. So mainly, local GBV responders are themselves affected by displacement, because we are people like others as well, insecurity as well, the economic hardship. So everyone is under this pressure. So at the same time, funding mechanisms remain highly rigid and short-term, while the needs require long-term investment in protection systems and in community resilience. Saying that, what is the role of women or of local women-led organization and community organizations? First, local actors are not only implementers. We all agree on that. They are the first one to respond. And in Lebanon, we can see these examples so frequently. And sometimes these women-led organizations are accessing some hard-to-reach areas where INGOs and UN agencies cannot reach for security reasons. So during emergencies, local organizations are often and sometimes always the first and last responders. They remain present before international attention arrives and continue after media attention fades. And this is really what's happening in Lebanon. Community-based organizations understand local dynamics. They know the social tensions and the protection risks in ways that external actors often cannot. So yet, localization is still too often discussed rhetorically rather than operationalized through equitable fundings and decision makings. If you want to talk about backlash against gender and GBV work in Lebanon, one of the most concerning trends globally and regionally is the growing backlash against gender equality and protection work. We all agree this. In terms of conflict, like in Lebanon, GBV services are often deprioritized. And we were talking now before starting the webinar that in Lebanon for GBV, we have received only $2 million now for this emergency, 19%. Can you imagine? 2 million, it's a peanut, nothing. So as I said, GBV services are often deprioritized despite the fact that violence against women increases. So protection cannot be treated as optional or postponed until after the crisis. It is a life-saving. We have to agree that GBV and protection is life-saving. So what needs to change? This is very important. Our recommendations. First, to have flexible and long-term funding. Multi-year support is important. Emergency flexibility, again, because from our experience, most of the donors, they are not flexible when it comes to emergency. And sometimes we are implementing activities that they are not anymore acceptable when there is emergency. So they need to be flexible. Core funding for local NGOs. We need to invest more in localization, equal partnership, direct funding, shared decision making. This is very important to have a shared decision making, because at the end of the day, we know the ground, we know our context, and they need to set their proposals and their concept note according to our needs. We need to prioritize staff well-being, because I think all of us agree that the mental health of the social workers, caseworkers, are really very bad during emergency. We have burnout. So burnout prevention is very important. Protection of frontline workers and humanitarian workers. In Lebanon, now with this war, we can see that humanitarian international law is not respected. We have social workers, we have health workers that they are attacked. So this is very important to highlight and to take into consideration. So again, integrated GBV across all humanitarian sectors is a recommendation. Through shelter, cash assistance, health, education, WASH, it should be integrated across all humanitarian sectors. If we want sustainable GBV programming during crisis, we must stop treating local actors as temporary subcontractors. We need investment in systems, in people, and long-term resilience. So to end my presentation, because I don't want to take more, women and girls in Lebanon are surviving not one crisis, but multiple overlapping crises at the same time. And despite immense challenges, I can say that local organizations continue to respond, adapt, and protect communities every day. So now the question is no longer whether local actors are capable or no. The question is whether the humanitarian system is ready to trust, to resource, and stand beside them. So hopefully we will have a response to this question. And thank you so much for your attention. And I'm ready for any question. Thank you.
Thank you, Jean. Please feel free to put your questions in the chat, and we will have them all at the end of the presentations. Now I would like to hand over to Kaniz Ghofrani Qureshi from Population Services and Training Center in Bangladesh, talking about the backlash impacting their work in this context. Kaniz, over to you, and I'm gonna share my screen for you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Shiva, and thank you, Sarah, to give me a chance to talk about the backlash scenarios of Bangladesh regarding gender-based violence. You know that in Bangladesh, these gender-based violence scenario is the same in the global as, and there is some deep-rooted causes for gender-based violence, and the definition of gender-based violence and women violence against women are restrictive, overlooking, and key dimension, and inadequately reflecting the intersectional identities women upholds. In recent few years, there is a political changes in Bangladesh. and scenarios and cultural uh, gender-based violence protection and cultural barriers are up increasingly uh, more and more. The I want to share some backlash regarding uh, gender-based violence, like bullying or moving for women clothing. This is a mm, scenario nowadays women are facing in Bangladesh. Uh, then, like in different types of scenario, harassment, assaulting are happening in Bangladesh now in few years, and some of are in public place, and most of the incident happening in public place, and they are uh, accused for Western clothes. This incident, the why they are wearing Western clothes publicly, and it's happening in the railway station in a tourist destination area like Cox's Bazar, and also there is a institutional pushback, like Bangladesh Bank are mm, uh, continuous dress code proposal from bodies such as Bangladesh Bank, whose initial ban on sleeveless tops and leggings drew widespread backlash, were ultimately withdrawn. Uh, after that, when people protest against this, then it was withdrawn. And another one is also alarming, that High Court bench probed a victim clothing during a bail proceeding, prompting mm, rights organizations such as Ain o Salish Kendra in Bangladesh to caution that remarks to this kind risks bouldering further harassment. Another one is digital harassment in Bangladesh. You know that digital harassment nowadays increase more and more. 89% of women who use social media nationwide have encountered at least one form of digital violence, and these violence impact that widespread abuse and rise of AI driven harassment, political and public silencing, and psychological troll. 65% of survivors describe meaningful psychological harm, and substantial share retreat from digital and public arenas altogether. Another one is the victimization of women survivors in Bangladesh. Survivors already victimized, when then again when they going to court or mm, uh, going to legal procedure, they have uh, again victimized, and then frequently label secondary victimization. This is a prevention pervasive, pervasive phenomenon in which the institutions meant to safeguard women and up inflicting additional harm, challenge, channeled through social stigma, local obstacles, and entrenched institutional bias. Uh, like social and communal victimization, like victim blaming, social ostracization, and character assassination. And another is institutional victimization, like police bias. When any survivor go to local thana, then for any GD or FIR, they police investigate and some questions which also victimize them again. There is a High Court investigation procedure in 2020 in 2018 in Bangladesh, that in rape case, High Court want uh, two finger test. This is also a victimization a case. And another is delayed justice. Estimate that 3% justice are happening within the time, but 97% are not any result. And there is legal and judicial hurdles in Bangladesh. Then Section 155 challenges and lack of witness protection. In this case, who are witness, they are sometimes abandoned in their cases because the witness backing them and subject to threats and physical intimidation by the accused. And another is compromise pressure. It is also for from the family and the victim to compromise. Uh, Another backlash in lack of exemplary punishment and uh, for violence against women. Mm, The in this case, the conviction crisis is I have also already said that real world conviction rates for rape and violence against women are placed at under 3%, meaning that upward of 97% of those accused walk away without legal prosecutions. Repercussions: massive case blocking. Over 117 thousand cases sit on the docket of the Nari o Shishu Nirjatan, women and child violence Daman Tribunal, violence, violence against women tribunals. And there is a rule of High Court that any case of violence against women mm, uh, must be resolved within 180 days. But there is a bulk of cases linger for 5 to 10 years. And uh, this long term are survivors cannot uh, lingering cannot go through these cases. High court high acquittal rates. This is another example for no punishment. Shoddy investigation paired with witness and intimidation mean most trial concludes with the accused walking free. And another thing nowadays happen that reduce the protest of movement of women rights activists and organization in Bangladesh for the political situation and the uh, rights movement are reduced dramatically reduced in Bangladesh. The reach and momentum of women rights mobilization in Bangladesh are confronting a complicated shrinking space by 2026. Even though women stood on the front line of 2024 uprising, their footprint in formal political organizing and street level protest has been steadily and eroded by extremist resistance and institutional roadblocks. Uh, what is the reason for reduced visibility? There is a reason for violent backlash, hardline religious movement, including fundamental groups, have mobilized large-scale counter rallies, some drawing more than 20,000 people against women rights reforms, leaving feminist activists exposed to elevated risk. Another is institutional sidelining. Although central to the monsoon revolution, women remain conspicuously thin on the ground in the interim government and across the emerging political leadership. During the February 2026 election in Bangladesh, only 30 of 51 parties heavyweight political party like fundamental party Jamati Islam among them put forward zero or token women candidates. The fear factor. Watchdog bodies such as Human Rights Watch documents a sharp rise in verbal, physical, and digital abuse against women, an environment that has silenced a significant share of victims. Security concern. Mob assault on news organizations such as a national uh, daily newspaper, Prothom Alo and Daily Star, along with attack on cultural institutions like Chayanot, Udichi, have steadily shrunk the safe venue where activists once gathered to organize. Anti-gender backlash navigating impact on funding in Bangladesh for responding gender-based violence. Anti-gender backlash sweeping across Bangladesh has placed considerable pressure on funding ecosystem behind gender-based violence, humanitarian work. Though coordinated online and on-the-ground campaigns, extremist factions have framed gender-focused aid as foreign agendas, driving up operational risk and producing acute funding shortfalls for both international and domestic agencies. By April 2026, Observer characterized the funding climate for gender-based violence services as profoundly challenging and significantly underfunded. UNFPA appeal gap. Within the 2025 to 2026 Joint Response Plan, UNFPA's request for gender-based violence and adolescent programming is running at 59% shortfall. Another one is Rohingya response scaling. In southern part of Bangladesh, there is a huge Rohingya 7 million and more than 7 million Rohingya slides in Bangladesh, and they are in Bangladesh. And for 2026, the Rohingya response update was scaled down and to $710 million, representing a 26% drop from the original 2025 requirement, a revision driven mainly by the strained funding climate and recurring gaps. Digital violence surge. Even as agencies rolled out initiatives such as Unite to End Digital Violence, they remain under resourced for pushing back against the increasingly sophisticated anti gender narratives and portfolio. And proliferating online. In these funding gaps remain unaddressed. The fallout for women and girls is expected to be both immediate and life-threatening. And service deprivation for this funding shortage. Over 200 million people stand to be cut off from essential gender-based violence, risk mitigation, and intervention services. Dignity kit shortage, core relief items among the dignity kits of sanitary and hygiene supplies uh, destined for more than 42,000 individuals could go undelivered. And child protection risk. Cash assistance programs aim to helping prevent child marriage. High risk household face the prospect of being shut down outright. Barriers to securing new funds. What is the barrier? Extremist misuse of aids. Reports have emerged of extremist groups using crowdfunding platform to siphon donations intended for disaster relief towards Islamist network. And the donor hesitation. Growing religious extremism and moral policing have tarnished Bangladesh international standing. Straining diplomatic relations with Western donors who typically fund gender equality program. Like many international organizations like Oxfam, donor like Oxfam and mm, mm, ICANN, Netherlands based donor and many other donors, they are changed their funding strategy. Now they are not they are going to funding on another issues uh, without gender-based violence and like uh, other funding. And shrinking civic space, many women-led organizations face increased security and personal attacks on their staff, making it difficult to maintain the operational transparency required by international donor. In response agencies such as UNHCR are learning into male role model. This is a change strategy for new programming and reduce gender-based violence. They are introducing male role model programs designed to cultivate grassroots backing for gender equality with the goal of easing the security concern that frequently deter respective donors. This is all from Bangladesh scenario and regarding gender-based violence. Thank you for your patience sharing.
Thank you so much, Kanis. Thank you. It was really good to have this like detailed account of how this backlash is working on different levels. So from policy and legal limitations that are also working on the communal level of with the resistance to gender equality from hardliner groups, like in this changing political environment in Bangladesh. Thank you so much. And now I'll move to Sherry. Yeah, from Seed Kurdistan. Over to you. I'm not gonna add more to that.
Thank you, Shiva, and nice thanks to everybody that's here today and to the other speakers. It was great hearing about their environments. We did a GBV backlash session with the GBV COP in November 2024, and at that time, the backlash was quite significant. Oh, I just want to clarify, our organization name is SEED, and the Kurdistan is just part of our email address. So for many years, we've been seeing a tremendous backlash against women leaders, candidates, organizations, academics. That's been quite broad and deep, and it has gone from the online space to real life and the offline space. And so that's kind of what we presented in November 2024. But over the last year, we've seen the backlash sort of ebb in visibility. But we think it's not a real representation of the risks, which remain extremely high. And we think the public backlash has been displaced by larger security events, instability, war in our region affecting Kurdistan and Iraq, security issues. We've had stalled government formation, both in Baghdad and in the Kurdistan region. And related to all of this has been a huge increased economic strain and funding cuts. So we believe, so I wanted to talk a little bit today about, yes, the backlash, but also why we're seeing it ebb and what we think the risks are. And I think that all of these funding cuts that we've experienced, that Kanis just talked about and others have talked about, are reinforcing the conditions that drive the backlash. So first, in terms of characterizing the backlash, Shiva showed a report that I wanted to mention, a great report by UNRISD and UN Women. It's a 2025 report, Understanding the Backlash Against Gender Equality, Evidence, Trends, and Policy Responses. We thought it was excellent, and it really helped articulate some of the issues that we're facing in Iraq. So it argues that opposition to gender equality is not a new thing, but the current backlash is quite different in the recent years because it's more organized, it's better funded, it's increasingly transnational. So there are movements being funded across countries, and it's very broadly linked. It's closely linked to the broader anti-democratic and authoritarian movements happening globally. And this backlash, as we've heard in the other speakers, has resulted in very concrete rollbacks of policy, weakening of frameworks, less funding for gender equality work and GBV work, restrictions on civic activity, and harassment against individuals and leaders and organizations. And so the backlash is not simply, as the report says, to resistance change, but it's described there as a deliberate effort to roll back the existing gains and rights for women, girls, and other vulnerable groups. And the report links the backlash to these bigger trends in democratic backsliding globally, economic insecurity. We saw it, and during COVID especially, we've seen huge global inflation. And we've seen it as a reaction to major advances that we've seen in women's rights. So women gaining more power in some contexts, gender rights as well. And it highlights the report highlights makes the implementation of critical global frameworks weaker, national frameworks weaker, and it's been really stalling progress. And we've seen this all borne out in Iraq. So what are we seeing in terms of why it's quieting in Iraq for now? We've seen that the GBV and gender equality system is quieter and weaker. And I think this is a reflection of the combined effects of the economic constraints, along with the pressures and the securitization of the civic space that we've seen in Iraq. Less so in the Kurdistan region, but still there's some impact here in terms of massively reduced funding for the GBV work and for gender equality. So we're seeing that there are far fewer actors providing services and running programs, and we run an entity called the GBV Sector Coordination Group. So after 2 years ago, almost 3 years ago, when the UN cluster system closed down and indicated that the humanitarian crisis is over and we're moving to a development space, we saw the cluster system close down and GBV resources shrink. So we stood up a mechanism called the GBV Sector Coordination Group to coordinate among GBV actors, and we co-manage this with the government. MOLSA, Ministry of Labor and Social Affairs. Well, at that time, at the height of our SCG group, we had 114 organizations, and now we have 42. So you can see it's a very dramatic reduction in the number of actors. And we've seen international actors leave and smaller local actors, and even some of the local actors have had to close down. So fewer programs are running, fewer GBV services. GBV services are very, very limited. And we've also seen this GBV services by the government shrink because they're also dependent to some degree during this 10-year crisis that we had, displacement crisis, ISIS crisis, very dependent on international funding. So we're seeing fewer awareness and prevention efforts, both by NGOs and government. We're seeing training events reduce, public advocacy campaigns reduce. And as I said, organizations have left. So in parallel to this, we're seeing increased NGO regulation in Iraq, increased security oversight, monitoring of the civil society space, and it really constrains what organizations can do. And it's just basically weakened the overall ecosystem on combating GBV and advocating for gender equality. And so as a result of this reduced space, reduced funding, we're seeing fewer visible flashpoints. So we're seeing less conflict in the last year, and it could be a reduction of activity and a reduction of our visibility. So it's drawing less backlash. In Kurdistan, the government has remained committed, but they've been a lot less vocal on the GBV issues and on gender equality. And we, as I mentioned, the international funding that sort of supported the Kurdistan government's protection services has decreased as well. So it's reduced their visibility and it reduced their capacity to do awareness, prevention, collaboration with organizations. And so that reduced government presence has also left local civic actors feeling more vulnerable and less supported. So the third sort of piece of this is that violence against women and girls remains high. We are not seeing reductions, and that's consistent with the persistence of these underlying drivers and risk factors. And then when we see that combined with weakened protection and deterrence, and the weakened protection of families and individuals. So we expect that violence went up, as Jean said, during periods of war. So we just had a 4-month period of war. And then last June also, we saw an uptick in violence and conflict in our region. And we expect during these periods, just like in like COVID, that people were restricted in their movements and there was increased stress and tension, economic tension, that violence goes up in this period. Unfortunately, we don't have good data because we don't have GBV IMS operating anymore due to the change in humanitarian to development. We don't have as much data collection, and we don't have government reporting. So actually, KRG recently reported that we've had nearly 12,500 domestic violence complaints in 2025. But we know that reporting is just a small reflection of the level of violence and incidents that actually exist. So separate monitoring, local monitoring by the March 8th committee, which is related to the personal status law, reported that 69 women were killed in the Kurdistan region. These are honor-based murders in 2026 so far. And 13 more, I believe that's 2025, and 13 in the first 2 months of 2026. So we still see a high level of incidents of violence and a high level of honor-based killing. And then we've also seen the rise in technology-facilitated gender-based violence. And this has been against women advocates, women candidates during elections. We've had 2 national elections. We've had regional elections in the last 2 years. And we've seen high rates of technology-facilitated child sexual exploitation and abuse. So very strong overlap with TFGBV. So global reports say 58 to 75% of women have experienced some online violence, some form of online violence, and young women are twice as likely to be targeted, and marginal groups face disproportionate rates of violence. So the intersectionality between race, religion, profession. And women in public office and in the media are at particular risk in Iraq and Kurdistan. In the Arab states, UN reports that as much as 60% of women using the internet have experienced online violence. And in Iraq, our rate is approximately 70% of women who have been affected by online violence. So we're seeing rising rates of violence against women online and girls. So during the recent war, just like in the COVID pandemic, the risk of online violence also has gone up because people are spending more time online and they're isolated doing remote work. They weren't in school, they weren't in workplaces. So during this period of war in Kurdistan, we were all remote. And perpetrators are emboldened when they're hidden behind screens, and victims are often unable to identify them. So violence takes more subtle, is more difficult to identify, and it delays incident reporting. Over the last few years, we've seen significant online attacks and campaigns against women leaders, candidates, influencers, activists, organizations like SEED and others. And this creates a huge deterrence for women entering the workforce or making a decision to be a candidate and enter political life. And of course, the risks of these targeted campaigns against women has dampened NGO and activist engagement, both online and offline. So again, combined with the reduced funding, we're less visible these days, right? So we're self-censoring because we're concerned about the risk of backlash. And these online campaigns are not just harassment, but they translate into real world threats. So we can take the experience of Choman Hardy, a leading academic here in the Kurdistan region and gender expert who suffered a very intense online campaign threatening violence against her, a court case against her for indecency, being stalked, followed, and she had to leave the country temporarily. So we're seeing it move from the online space to real world. And then in March 2026, so during this crisis, we saw the murder of a very prominent women's rights activist, Yunar Muhammad, in Baghdad. And we take this as a very serious warning sign, and it underscores the risks to activists. So here again, her murder, which was condemned by NGOs and the UN, but otherwise didn't receive a lot of attention or condemnation from government authorities in Iraq. And it's linked to broader risks facing women's activists, including threats from non-state actors and weak accountability and protection systems for women in general, but women in the public space in particular. In Kurdistan, we still have strong local government protection actors, but as I mentioned, they saw decreases in international funding for their protection work, and many security actors were focused on the war and distracted from their GBV prevention work, distracted from their protection against trafficking, child protection. So while we were in a period of war where we were being bombarded by missiles every day, the security actors were very distracted from their highly specialized mission. And finally, we're seeing worrisome Iraq-wide legal, policy, and political trends that are worrying and reinforcing the structural conditions that drive the backlash. So federal Iraq still lacks a domestic violence law. It's been stalled for more than a decade. In 2025, we saw the personal status law amended to decrease protections for women and girls and strengthen law options that undermine these protections. We 2025 prevent the use of the word gender. And so we've shifted our terminology in more broadly in Iraq to violence against women. We saw Iraq's Women Empowerment Department in the Iraqi Prime Minister's Office Secretariat change to the National Director of Iraqi Women. We saw that the personal status law amendment, and alongside of that, the Council of Representatives, the Parliament, different members of Parliament advocating to withdraw from CEDAW and other women's rights related instruments. So even though we didn't see a systematic attack against women's organizations, there was significant pressure on NGOs in both Kurdistan and Iraq, and increased security scrutiny of their activities. So we've seen a calmer 2026 so far, but we don't think that represents progress. And we don't think the risks of backlash have subsided. We think they remain extremely high. If GBV actors, again, resume more visibility and more advocacy and more activities, we think the backlash is likely to return quickly. And we can watch the following indicators I think Shiva mentioned. So attacks and threats against women actors, online campaigns against women leaders, shelters, NGOs, political rhetoric around family, morality, and foreign agendas. And then we see how it impacts the police and the judicial handling of femicide cases and IPV cases. Donor funding levels, again, very low for prevention, response, shelters, legal aid, and advocacy, because this backlash is global. And we think the backlash has impacted funding levels. So less noise doesn't mean lower risks. Organizations like SEED should remain cautious, and we can be lower profile when needed, but we shouldn't be passive because the structural drivers of inequality, violence, and backlash remain in place, and we need to continue to advocate for resources. How am I doing on time? I just have a few more points, Shiva. Am I okay?
Yeah, please, and then I'll go to the Q&A directly.
Okay.
Yeah.
So a lot of what's been done in response to the backlash to date has been considered like evasive maneuvers, like maintaining a lower profile, adjusting language. Again, UN agencies have opted for technology-facilitated violence against women instead of GBV, and repackaging our programming. So these sort of strategies can buy some time and relieve some pressure, but arguably they do little to impact the fundamentals. So what do? So one thing in Iraq and Kurdistan, as we move further away from the humanitarian crisis to this development phase in Iraq, we've been working to reframe the conversation. And this is also highlighted in the report that Shiva and I mentioned, where gender issues become vulnerable when they're treated as a separate sector rather than being integrated into what we do on governance, on democracy, on development, and social justice agendas. So we're still very much doing our GBV work and collaborating with GBV actors, but we're focusing more in the public space on empowerment, rights, and not necessarily as a women's agenda or issue, but focusing on gender equalities linked to mainstream issues like governance issues, economic growth, human capital, security and stability issues, democratic participation. And so the issue becomes more about development, family stability, resilience, state security, and sovereignty. And we're working to link gender equality and low levels of violence with participation and broader political discussions, pragmatic policy agendas in all of those areas, like working with the labor movement and working with child protection and working with youth movements. And so I'll just close that our best bet here in Iraq and maybe in some of the other places is to focus on a shared vision for our society as a prosperous, stable, democratic place with government institutions that provide services to all equitably and protect people's rights, and link our gender equality goals to these broader sort of priorities for society. And with that, I'll close. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sherry. That was really interesting. First, with the comprehensive overview on how this context for Iraq as a country transitioning out of humanitarian and for development is like this dynamic is playing out there. And just for everyone's information, so SEED has kindly presented previously on GBV AOR monthly calls about their role in co-chairing this GBV sector since that transition. And it is still available on GBV AOR YouTube channel in case you would like to listen to that. And also thank you for closing on that positive note about what can be done about reframing gender discussion in the broader vision that we have for the society. Thank you so much. I'm gonna close the question. I'm not sure if Canis is still here.
I'm
Yeah.
here.
Thank you. I think the first one, thank you, Sarah, for monitoring the chat and for sharing the questions with me. The first one is asking about, well, we have all mentioned about how there is this increased attacks to humanitarian workers, specifically women, and they're asking how they can continue their job. Are there any technology that they can still manage to have access and reach the communities that they're for doing their job and at the same time to make sure they're safe? I don't know, Sherry, Jean, and Kaniz, if any of you have any ideas about this, please feel free.
Go ahead, Cherry. Go.
So I think that we've worked really hard to maintain our services to communities, and we're continuing to do that, even as others have been forced to close. And as Jean said, that we think it's important to fund others, and we seek opportunities to share with opportunities with others to support other smaller organizations to keep up the grassroots work, and we do that where we can. We also support the government's GBV services where we can so that they can continue their important protection work, and we see government as a key partner for us, especially in the operation of government shelters, which we support. And then in terms of the technology, we don't see technology as reducing risk necessarily. I think there have been some efforts here in Kurdistan to use technology to share information, to share access to help. But people here, many people call the government's hotline and just want to ask questions, and they don't want to identify themselves. So any reporting regimes that require people to state who they are and their phone number, we haven't really seen that kind of tech work out that well. But in terms of technology to increase access of information to the population, yes, we've seen that broadly applicable and useful. It's a great way to share information, especially when you're working remotely and you're not able to go and do face-to-face services. So that's another thing. We have, during periods of remote work, we have switched to online, of course, not in our shelter or in the government shelters, but for GBV services and mental health services, we did shift online during the war, and we do what we can, and technology has helped us do that.
Thank you so much. Jean, would you like to add something?
Yeah, thank you so much, Sherry. Definitely what Sherry shared, it's the same in Lebanon as well. I would like to say that we had a lot of remote services coming back, even though they are not so effective as if it is in person, especially for GBV. When we talk about case management and GBV services, it's much better to have them in person, but sometimes we are obliged and we don't want to stop this service. So it was through WhatsApp, through remote sessions. That's what we do. And currently as well, because the war is having it has been for more than 6 7 months. What I think that there is some organization who started developing as well applications on WhatsApp and on the mobile, so they can provide their services, and especially to provide how to say oh, I forgot the word, the pathway, the referral pathway, to know where they can find the services, what services are provided, and where. So I think now technology is really used more frequently because of the war and all that. But unfortunately, it's not so much effective because, again, when we talk about women and girls, sometimes they are not very familiar with technology, sometimes the internet connection as well, and other challenges. But yet, we are trying to cope with different issues. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Canis, please feel free to come in. I mean, I cannot spotlight you because of the video, but yeah,
Yes.
please.
Uh, yeah, in Bangladesh, there is a legal and support framework also for the digital bullying, cyber bullying. There is the Cyber Security Ordinance 2025 placed in replace previous conventional laws. And this cybersecurity ordinance formally criminalized sexual harassment, revenge porn, and AI generated harmful contents. And the Police Cyber Support Center for Women, a specialized unit launched in 2020 that has assigned over 60,000 women as a mid of 2024, and another emergency hotline for victims, and encouraged to use 999 and another is 109, which is violence against women and children helpline. These two national emergency number are using for any kind of um, any kind of violence or any kind of harassment happening for this in Bangladesh.
Thank you so much, Canis, for your response. I think the next one is mainly for John, because it was like the recommendations that you had mentioned. They're asking if the backlash is increasingly on the political and ideological level, and it's not just financial. Do you think funding and localization alone can solve it? And what additional strategies are needed when the core issue is contestation over women's role and rights-based language? Over to you.
Yes, yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for this question. It's really very interesting question. And yes, there is backlash at the political level as well, because we can see that there is no a good representation of women at the political level, either at the ministry level or at the parliamentarian as well. That's why we are advocating a lot to have this quota, the political quota for the representation of women in the parliament and in the ministries. Regarding the localization, of course, if we work more on localization and we have more decision making of women in the political side and in the decision making tables and processes, of course, we can have a better step for localization. Because at the end of the day, if we don't have a good representation of women at the parliamentarian level, so we cannot change laws. And there is a lot of discriminatory laws in Lebanon against women. If we talk about violence, if you can talk about the nationality to be provided for her children, Lebanese woman mother cannot provide her nationality to her kids if she's married from another nationality other than Lebanese. So there is a lot of discriminatory laws. So I think that if there is women in the decision making, of course, we can have better result, and we can enhance the situation of women and girls. And localization to provide funds for a women-led organization, I mean, a direct fund, flexible fund, it is as well a key to try to change our laws and to advocate more. Because if we don't have the fund, we cannot sustain and we cannot provide any service.
Thank you so much, Jean. The next one is about, we all mentioned the institutional changes and shifts in their focus on GBV and gender work, or even just like renaming this area of work. They're asking, should there be an internal safeguard or evidence before teams decide to scale down or to change name or anything? And just to say, at least from my side, what we saw in the early months after the defunding or that stop work order, the decisions were made on the level that there was no GBV or gender actor on that level to have any say over either its renaming or changing the policies or anything. And of course, this changed after a few months when sorry about my dog, when the initial shock had decreased. But yeah, over to you if you have any response on this one.
So our approach, and like I said, we're currently feeling like in a period of calm, but our approach when things were very hot were to be assessing constantly what terminology we used in what place, what activities we did, what activities we promoted online. Like we did a lot of things in practice without putting it in the social media space, so to not draw attention, and just a lot of renaming of things. We're always extremely careful in this context. So our men and boys program, which we did with Equimundo, we didn't call it toxic masculinities. We called it healthy families, strong communities, right? Our women's empowerment program is called Thriving Together. So these things are very carefully worded to build community acceptance, because if we turn off all of our partners before we get in the door, so these are the kinds of things that also we need to focus on. We are for family happiness and stability, right? But we are for violence reduction, and we are for, so we just have to be careful always in this context, and then we constantly assess. So when during the high point, we were constantly assessing every couple of weeks, every 2 weeks, we were assessing what's the language, what's the word. The one thing that we didn't do here at SEED, although we can use violence against women instead of GBV, is we didn't capitulate completely to what was going on in the rest of Iraq. You know, we really decided that we need to remain firm and call things what they are. And sometimes we use violence against women. It just depends on the context, but we just can't capitulate on everything out of fear, or else we won't be able to make change.
Yeah, and maybe just to add another, like if it's what I mentioned about the stop work order, and what you're mentioning is like organizations sometimes are changing their terminology or maybe kind of not putting the advocacy publicly because to make sure they have their operational presence, which is kind of different to organization being forced to change that by donor expectations and because of backlash that they're getting from either international organization or the donor instead of the country that they're operating it. So yeah, also.
So I'll just add a little bit on our organizational perspective, which is we are maybe activists at heart, but our organization does a lot of work with government and at the community level. But we're not always trying to prove a point. We're always pretty careful because we don't want to, lose more funding, right? We want to maintain the funding. So reframing things in terms that are more acceptable sometimes happens. And we think that it's more important to have the success on the issue than to, be provocative all the time. There are times to be provocative, but it doesn't have to be all of the time. And so we're kind of careful that way as an organization, and we appreciate the activists that are on the front line and pushing the difficult issues all the time. But that's just not been our organizational style because we want to see the policies and the laws change more than what we want to prove a point, right? We want to see the actual impact in the environment, and that means cultivating people to your point of view. And that doesn't always mean shoving certain terminology down people's throats. So this delicate balance.
Yeah, thank you so much.
I want to add some changes strategy in Bangladesh. The strategy and decentralized movements are taking place that there is a coalition building. The women organizations are trying to build a coalition and national policy reform platform to raise their voice to change the policies and to the political parties and others organization. And another is open protest. They prohibit open protest. The human chain activists have human chain protest and such highlights violence against women while managing security risk. This is human chain is less than risky than other procession. And the policy advocacy, then there was a Women's Affairs Reform Commission who were sitting with the women leads organization and the humanitarian organization for structural changes like criminalizing marital rape and reforming inheritance laws, and even in the face of extremist opposition. These type of strategy are taken by the women leads and humanitarian organizations in the changing situation in Bangladesh.
Thank you so much, Kenny. I'm conscious about time, where I'm just gonna say what were the questions. In case any of you can respond, please feel free. And we are also going to launch the poll. If anyone wants to leave after that, please feel free to go. But we are also like staying here in case Sherry and John and Kenny's are also here. They have time to continue this discussion. But yeah, one is about there are things we talked about this explicit prohibition and backlash, but sometimes it's operating in a less formal or openly way. How do we respond to those ones? And there is also something about, well, the shocks that are affecting the humanitarian sector around gender and women, and we see like our usual way of working is not as impactful as we would like have to see. So what are the ways that we think we can fundamentally transform the way we work on gender and GBV? And the last one is about if there are any data that you know of about any research on violence against aid workers, women aid workers, if this has increased in the past few months, past few years, or if you have any research or data or any insights on that one. Thank you.
I can respond to the last question, and I think Jessica is the one who raised this. There is no data which is specifically for women workers, women aid workers. It's about humanitarian workers and social workers, health workers in general, but it is not disaggregated specifically for to know how many women and girls. But it's good to know, and I think it make us reflect and try to identify this, because I think it's a very good point. Thank you so much for the question and for this reflection. Thank you.
Thank you. I don't know, Sherry or Candice, if you want to
Yeah.
for any of the other questions.
There is no data how many because of fund shrinking, how many are jobless now. I do not know. I don't have any data, but a huge number of employee are jobless now, because you know that in Bangladesh and in globally the USAID funding is closing, and for that a huge number of people who are now jobless globally, and this is also a crisis for, and there is no alternative, and other funding source are nowadays visible for minimize the gap. So it is mm, very humanitarian crisis, and also to push the gender-based violence issues uphold.
Yeah, thank you. About that, I mean, there was also parallel discussion in the chat about the impact on humanitarian staff and the people that they've been losing their jobs in the past few months, and the impact that it has on programming, but also on the community of GBV and gender actors. I don't know if anyone else would like to add anything. Otherwise, if Sherry, Jean, and Kenny's are happy, we can share their email address when we share the resources and the recording of the webinar. If anyone would like to have any follow-up discussion or question, you can reach out to them. Yeah, great. Thank you so much. Thank you. A huge thank you to Sherry, Jean, and Kenny's for the very insightful presentations on these three contexts. And thank you to anyone attending the meeting and this webinar, and also for your questions, who was also like really added much to the discussion. Thank you so
Thank you.
much, and
Thank you
we'll
so
be in
much.
touch.
Stay
Yeah.
safe. Bye-bye.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Thanks,
So much.
everyone.
Thank you. Nice.